going, Bart? You okay in there?
Reset and restarting the computer seemed to help. So apparently when the computer's I have a theory.
What's your theory?
Communism works?
No, here's my theory, and listen to this. This is big, if true. I have a theory that when you haven't shut your computer down in a while and Wi-Fi is running slow, that that it intensifies everything, and that if you restart and clear a lot of the gunk out, that it clears up capacity for the only thing you have up and running, which is the thing you just started, because you've just turned the computer on and off. Tony, what do you think? Possible? Is this possible?
I mean, computer scientists and Wi-Fi experts would be horrified, just absolutely horrified. But yes, kind of is the truth. There's a buffering. There's a bunch of buffering that happens, and there's a bunch of compression that happens in the protocols. And so, like, if you clip out, if you sort of reset it all, then you end up with a similar effect as.
Hey everybody, we're live.
That was the worst validation.
And
let me just say that was a really long of saying, yes, Bart, you are 100% correct, and the science backs you up.
Yeah, that's what I meant to say.
Hey everybody, you walked in to hashtag SPSM. It's the Suicide Prevention Social Media Chat. We're so excited to have you here. Are we as excited as Maroon 5 and all of the amazing people on that music video? No, of course not. We're only the second most exciting thing on YouTube this week. We're also really excited.
What's the first most exciting thing on
Maroon
YouTube?
5 came out with this new video. Did you not see it? And every important woman's in it or whatever, and they're all dancing around him. It's fun.
Okay, are you saying important to women or just important in general?
God only knows what's important to you. So we are excited. We know that we're coming to you with another tech show, and we're rounding out. Next week is going to be sort of the big wrap up for season 5. We're going to be discussing sort of what the audience's wants and needs are for when we sort of do the real reboot. We're going to be retooling our mission, retooling some of the content that we're doing, where we're doing the content. And we're going to be really thinking through how we do social media projects, sort of as there's been all this platform shift. So enjoy the heck out of Twitter while you can is sort of my parting shot about that. I'm at Doc Foreman. Everybody say hello to Tony Wood. Tony, say hi to the people.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tony Wood. You know all the rest of this, everybody. But I'm the chairman of the board of the American Association of Suicidology, as well as the CEO of Quantify, and a bunch of other stuff. But donate your data today, ourdatahelps.org.
And big shout out to Marshall. Big shout out to Ren, how are you? Big shout out, of course, to Megan, who is taking a little bit of self-care tonight. Bart, say hello to the people.
Good evening, everybody. Dr. Bart Andrews. You can find me on Twitter at Bart Andrews. I'm the Vice President of Telehealth, Home and Community Service at a groovy little crisis line in St. Louis, Missouri called Behavioral Health Response. I'm currently in El Paso, Texas, an amazing part of the country, by the way, where it is really hot and there's amazing hiking and mountain biking that a lot of the locals don't seem to appreciate. In fact, when I told them about my mountain experience, they all implied that there was something wrong with me. And I think Bart, there might be.
End up dead in a ravine.
Hey, Bart, do you know the difference between a hippo and a Zippo?
No, Tony. What is the difference between a hippo and a Zippo?
Well, a hippo is really heavy, and a Zippo is just a little lighter.
A little bit lighter, isn't it?
Bart,
and that's science, my friends.
A little
Bart,
lighter.
say hello to Tom Cruise. He's not precisely in the desert. I don't know if you see the pictures he's tweeting out from fucking Greece.
Hi, Tom. We love your new life. We're jealous of your new life.
Bart, do you want to talk about the thriving activity at the VFW down there?
I do not. No, I do not.
Not a busy place.
Nope, I don't.
The W.
And Chris Maxwell, take it away. Say hi to the people.
Hey, everybody. I'm Chris Maxwell. I'm Communications Coordinator for the American Association of Suicidology. I'm really thrilled to have Sean on the show tonight. This is going to be a really great conversation. The research that he's been doing has been really intriguing, and it it intersects directly with a lot of the different topics that we've already been talking about. So April nailed this one, and I'm super excited to listen to what Sean has to say.
And this is really, this episode is really courtesy Sean Erriger, who knows that I'm on a personal mission to collect every person who's ever written an ethics article about social media, data, and suicide. Pretty much. Because there's what now, like 3 of you, I think? Tony, do I have that? Glenn, Mike, and Sean now? Maybe 4?
Who's counting, April?
And maybe the only one that hasn't been stalked by Fox News. So anyway, so Sean Erriger sends me a link in my Facebook messages, says, look, there is yet another Twitter article, Twitter ethics article. And of course, I'm so excited because this YouTube channel is the only YouTube channel that owns the entire bibliography for that, right? And I'm reading this when I'm sort of puzzled by the story. And we're going to have our guest sort of introduce herself and tell the story, because he did not set out to have this experience. He gets sort of wrapped up in sort of a very interesting turn of events and ends up writing an article. Sean, introduce yourself to the people.
Hello, people. I am Sean Young. I'm at UCLA. I'm here in Los Angeles right now, about a mile from UCLA. I'm a medical school professor at UCLA and the executive director of the University of California Institute for Prediction Technology, which is a big data science consortium of researchers where we use social data, like social media data, wearable device data, online search data, for predicting different events, and then try to solve them, try to prevent them. So we work with government agencies and corporations to try to solve them.
And you know our good friend Moon, as a matter of fact, right?
I do, exactly. Yeah, I'm going, when am I going out to Atlanta? So she was here a couple of weeks ago. And I said, oh, let's meet in Irvine. I grew up in Newport nearby. And I said, there's great spots in Irvine. And I told her to meet. She said, can we meet somewhere close to campus? And I was like, let's try this area right here. Here's a new spot. And then I think I brought her to probably like the worst food place in Irvine, it turned out. We're sitting there. It was our first in-person meeting. And I felt so bad. She was just like looking at the food, not eating it. I was like, okay, let's go somewhere else. Yeah, we talked about, so we've known each other as academics, we've known each other for a while, and then we're now working together. So we have weekly calls and working on some grant ideas, and she's just a great researcher in the area.
So, and I'm so excited because, when I met Moon, it was just a few years ago at the the Clinical Psych and Computational Linguistics conference. That's starting up, I believe, on Tuesday. I'm actually meeting up with a bunch of the folks for that conference tomorrow night in New Orleans at our nose. The food's going to be a little bit better. I'm not saying I'm trying to show you up, Sean, but maybe just a little. But tell everybody what you were trying to find out and how you end up finding out about suicide, because I don't think that's your normal issue.
Yeah, I'm actually, so I was mentioning, I guess most of my work has been on HIV prevention, HIV work, some drug abuse research, but I'm a behavioral and social psychologist, so kind of agnostic in terms of the area I was focusing on. And we started the background on this. When was this? Back in 2015, we were running a study where we wanted to look at health among freshman students. So we'd been doing some work with different social media companies, and they cared about looking at online safety and evaluating devices that they had. And so we, using the tools and using the technologies we had, we said, let's do this study on UCLA freshman students. These were incoming freshman students. I think it was 2015. And the transition from high school to college, stressful transition. And so we wanted to see, can we be able to give them wearable devices and track sleep and activity? Can we give them weekly surveys? And can we follow them on Twitter? And it was really exploratory just to figure out what can we do with these different data sources to predict something about students. That really wasn't more than that. And so,
can we just take a pause, because I want to recognize something about the study that you were doing, not the one we're talking about, but that you're using sort of movement data, sort of like a Fitbit or some sort of that you're using language data from their Twitter, and that you're also doing sort of these like check-in surveys and having this really, what we would consider just a really ideal sort of set of different data streams, which we think is fabulous that you're doing. And of course, Bart, what happens, Bart is going to give you the little hint. What happens, Bart, when you start tracking a whole bunch of people about sleep?
Well, you're going to find out that there's a percentage of those folks that are struggling with a lot of depression and or suicide thoughts, because that's a real common predictor of suicide risk. So sleep disturbance, we know that a lot of sleep disturbance can prompt a suicide crisis. It just impacts everything. So I think that studying sleep is so important. If you're going to be studying sleep, at some point you're going to run into people who are also struggling with suicide, because those populations are going to overlap.
So what happened, Sean?
Yeah, we did not know what we were getting into. We do this study.
Sleep, right?
It wasn't, so it was partially about sleep. We were doing this in partnership. So Intel was involved, UCLA Chancellor Gene Block, who's a sleep researcher, was involved. So it was probably more about sleep than anything else, but it was really, let's track people and see what we can do with their data and try to make some predictions about it. So we go through the regular process of IRB submission. We fill out the IRB forms. We get 200 UCLA freshman students, all pretty healthy as far as we know. Get them to fill out these surveys on stress and activity and different things. And we ended up finding out a lot of things. We can talk about that if you want, about what we found out about stress and what we found out about sleep. But there's...
Did you just tease us?
But there's one, but we end up finding that we're following these students on social media, and there's one student, and she is she's saying she's going to kill herself repeatedly. And did not prepare for that. We didn't know what to do. We sort of uncovered her. We also just even figured that out in kind of a backwards way, because the process of what we're doing is trying to set up so models ultimately to be able to flag for, let's say, if people aren't sleeping well, or if student health needs to intervene, cyberbullying, we were looking at things like that. And just from looking at this one student, she was tweeting at a bunch of bands, and like all of her tweets were at these different bands, and none of the other students were doing that. So we thought, okay, let's just look in a little bit deeper for this specific student of why she seems to be tweeting at these bands only and not at any friends or anyone else, unlike the other students. And so that's when we see she's talking about she's going to kill herself repeatedly. And so what do? We contact the IRB, and the IRB says, this is your study. You more or less figure out what to do. We're just here for you to evaluate things, but you got to figure it out. And that was, so we contact Student Psychological Services.
Wait. So you go to the authority figure and they said, good luck, Buttercup. Is that basically what happened?
I don't want to, they said, it's been evaluated. We can offer feedback, but in terms of actually taking action on it, we're not the body that will tell you, here's what you need to do. You have a protocol in place and you need to follow the protocol. Well, our protocol doesn't say anything about what to do if we encounter a situation like this, because we never anticipated it. We were just naive about something like this happening, right? And so we contact Student Psychological Services and we say, we've got this girl and she needs help right now. Can we get her some help? And they said, well, we can't contact her because we're not able to go in and get the contact information of someone. We can't just, you can't give us the contact information and have us look, because that would be an invasion of privacy. And so there was just kind of this confusion of how do we get this person and get help. And ultimately we were able, working together with the IRB and Student Psychological Services, and we were able to link her and get her to help. And she's been seeking help and been getting help at Student Psychological Services. But it became a strange situation as a public health researcher of, just what do we do in something like this? And so we wrote this paper from our own lack of knowing what to do in a situation like this, and was actually really surprised about what kind of response we've gotten. And I think it shows how much smarter than all the people are out there than me for having planned this because of their interest in this study. I first thought, so we first tried to publish this in 1 or 2 journals, and it got rejected. And they said, this is a case study. This is one single event. It's not really, it's not worth publishing. And then ultimately, JMIR published this, JMIR Mental Health. And we were really surprised about the response that we got. We got a lot of people asking about it, saying, this is really important. And to me, my first thought when we got those responses is this is just like research in social psychology, which after the fact, this to me seemed pretty obvious that the main take home of the point we were trying to make is let's start a discussion on this of when you go into something where you have no idea, you go in thinking this is a healthy population, we're studying something completely unrelated to suicide, and that we should have a suicide protocol in place anyway. IRB is very familiar with that with other things. If we're talking about offline and you're dealing with people with mental illness or whatever it is, you've got to have a suicide protocol in place. If you're dealing with drug use and you're asking people about, are they thinking of harming themselves, you got to have a suicide protocol in place. But not for online studies monitoring people on Twitter, just it hadn't been done before. So this paper was about getting this discussion in place and having a protocol and some steps that we've learned. But so my initial thought was, I was surprised people were responding to this and that this paper got the attention that it did, because after the fact it seemed obvious. But then as I thought about it, I realized everyone who was contacting us is way smarter than I was and than we were for doing this from the start, because they realized the importance of this in upfront of being able to know you can't anticipate things, but you need to have protocols in place to anticipate all these unknown things. And so it's just become, it's led to probably a lot more questions than answers for me anyway. So long story short, that's why it's awesome that you guys invited me here. Hoping you guys have some answers.
Well, I'm betting that Chris and Bart, I'm betting Chris and Bart are going to want to chime in, and probably Tony too. Which you guys want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, this is so important, Sean. And when I saw the article, I was so impressed, because this is something that's going to happen a lot more as more and more research, and we're seeing the beginnings of what's going to be very common, which is research in social media and doing monitoring students' digital space, and anybody's digital space. And we're going to run into this. I've got to admit that I'm going back to the Princess Bride here. The Counseling Center committed one of the classic blunders that just has irked me for the last 25 years of mental health. Let me be abundantly clear to all of the mental health professionals out there. If someone contacts you about a client, or you're a counseling center and they contact you about a student, it is not a breach of their privacy for you to reach out to the student. So this bizarre, and it's based on a really bad training model and poor understanding of HIPAA. But if someone calls you about a patient or
remember there's FERPA too.
It doesn't make any difference. Reaching out to the person directly based on a third-party report is not a breach of that student's privacy. In fact, it's unethical not to. So if you get a third-party report, this is how people end up dead when we could have prevented it quite clearly. When you get a third-party report saying, we think this student is in danger, or your client's in danger, you don't have to tell the reporting party anything. That could be a problem depending on what you tell them, but you are fully capable. In fact, crisis lines get calls from about perfect strangers, and if we have a phone number, we'll reach out to a perfect stranger. It is not a breach of HIPAA. You haven't violated anybody's privacy, and in fact, failing to do so. And I've been involved in cases where people got third-party reports, it didn't do anything, and people ended up dead when there is no rule that would prevent that. It's just really bad problem solving and bad ethical reasoning.
Chris?
Yeah, no, I think.
And I think just for one thing, so I don't show up tomorrow and have UCLA yelling at me.
But they might.
So,
you just send it to Bart. He's ready for him.
They send it to me. I'll set them straight. I'm sure they'll be really open to it as well.
Right. So I think the Twitter part of it also had something to do with it. You know, we linked people. So we had their email, we had their phone number, we had the Twitter handle. But you know, it's possible that someone else can tweet from a Twitter handle. You don't know that that's actually the person that they were that was tweeting. There's a lot of possible unknowns. And so I don't know. I know it was just the first response was not as clear as I thought it would be, not having experience in this area. I thought it would just be.
You're incredible. You are so, yes, all those things are 100% true, and you did a great job reframing that. Chris, what do you got to say?
No, yeah, and I'm kind of echoing Rin Linthicum too. She tweeted out that she's not surprised that IRBs were unsure how to proceed. Just in this context, it's new. It's something that we obviously know is not something that a lot of people think about. And I'm not saying anything negative about UCLA's IRB. I have a suspicion that this is going to be a really wide-reaching issue that we're going to see a lot more of. But what I think is really interesting is that the IRB had, I mean, this is the review board that was supposed to be making sure that you had things in place in the first and at the beginning of the research study, that it would certify that the research study would have things covered. And so they were unaware that this might be a possibility as well. The people who are in charge of making sure that things are in place. So what we're seeing is that the general, what we've been talking about for the last few weeks is that the general public is largely unaware of the impact that their social media data has in everyday life. They are very naive and unaware about their digital shadow. And when signing up for things through APIs and through Facebook quizzes and et cetera, people just generally don't understand how their data works and how it's being used and who's looking at it. And so I think what we're seeing reflected here is that larger institutions are suffering from that lack of knowledge too. So I'm curious as to how we can help those institutions as well, and just from a leadership process down too.
Yeah, I right on with your point. I mean, so UCLA, I think we have 4 or 5 IRBs, if I remember. Usually the work that we do usually goes to one IRB, which was this one. And it's more social sciencey type work. There's also a number of medical IRBs. Each IRB is almost like a different animal with a different culture and different beliefs. And so this same IRB, well, I first got to UCLA in 2008, and we did a study. We did our first HIV prevention study, and it was using Facebook for HIV prevention, developing a peer-led intervention on social media and using that to increase HIV testing. It took 10 months to get approval through our IRB. And so we'd submit, we'd get a response back, and the response, a lot of it didn't really make sense. So we'd submit again, get a response back. Finally, after months of doing this, the IRB called me, and they said, you know, can we just ask you questions directly? And I had never had that happen before, but I thought, great, this is this. And I heard the people on the phone. I didn't really know. I was new faculty in general, and didn't really know how confidential the process needs to be. And so I hear the people who are on the IRB committee, and most of them, were probably over 65, had no experience, didn't know what Facebook even was at the time. This was 2008. And so I realized I'm writing this up. I just come from Stanford, and writing this up where I was in the heart of Silicon Valley and tech and social media, and had this assumption that everyone knew what Facebook was who was reviewing it, because this is an academic institution and they have to know about new tech tools like we did at Stanford. And what I realized is, as a researcher working in any kind of new area, it's our responsibility to from the start make an introduction to the IRB, tell them about, and really, and this is what they expect of us. They expect us to know the risks and benefits and the issues better than the IRB. You know, so that's one thing. So we need, as researchers, when we're submitting it, we need to be aware of these things. I don't blame the IRB as much for this. This was me not anticipating this.
Yeah,
but
also, the Student Counseling Center should have known, just FYI.
Okay. But the other thing is, what I've learned from this, and just to get at what you're saying, Chris, is I need to, so now every time I submit something to the IRB, they're like, oh no, what's this guy, another thing coming from him? This is, please stop. But what I've learned is linking in with our IRBs and being able to spend time teaching them, because they want that. And I didn't know, as a new researcher, I didn't know that was possible. But I think that's what, if either you guys, or, because a lot of researchers don't have, they're either not aware or don't want to do that, or whatever it is. There's some kind of, and they typically expect also, as for, I was an assistant professor at the time, and they tell assistant professors, don't sit on committees, save your time for when you're, sit on committees when you're, once you have tenure, when you're older. But they need people to sit on committees who have a good understanding of the technology. And so maybe that's where you guys can come in also, in helping to educate IRBs. But that's, that's what needs to happen. IRBs need education.
You're speaking straight from our manifesto maybe a year ago. And so, like, I'm going to be speaking with a group later this week, same situation. And it's an IRB for doing a webinar, and then outcomes on a webinar. And of course, opposite to you, we've gotten this sort of list of catastrophic thinking, where they're like risk management. And I've said, well, this is risk management, not risk elimination. Like, you can't prevent incredibly unlikely events from happening. And anywhere, like, not, you know, if you're doing a pencil and paper survey with students, one student could walk in with a gun and mow everybody down. That's probably not going to happen, but you don't have to have an active shooter protocol in your IRB. Like, being able to put this into terms that people understand. One of the things that I would like to own responsibility for, related to your experience, is that you shouldn't know that. You're not a suicidologist, nor necessarily should your IRB, but there should be people that they could call and say, and of course, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, I know we're all very, interact a lot with their leadership. I don't know if they would have been the experts, but they would have known who to call. Or, and many of them have relationships with Facebook, Twitter. You know, we have relationships with, Tumblr, whatever, about, like, how are those things handled? But someone should have said, oh, here's basically how you handle that. Because, Sean, we do a live stream with all sorts of social interaction once a week for 5 years. And so very occasionally we have ethical dilemmas that come up, and we work on them together. I think we've handled them, like, they've been relatively few and far between, and they've been relatively low drama, and relatively straightforward. But we took, we had a grounding in digital ethics before we started the show. And honestly, before I even ventured into social media, there should be a few experts that people just can find a little bit easier, right? So, like, if a researcher like you comes across this as a surprise, and you and I know you're not going to, it's not like there are only ever going to be 5 researchers in predictive technologies. Like, this is a bigger and bigger thing, right? And suicidality is actually fairly common. It's a 10th leading cause of death. So we probably need to have consultants that are intuitive defined and have fairly straightforward answers for you, right? Or material that you can find. And right now, you either run into one of us who knows, or you have the situation you have. Go ahead.
And that, I mean, I want to throw out a quick shout out to AAS, and that AAS has members who are experts in a number of different different areas, multidisciplinary approaches to a lot of different things, researchers who have done a lot of these kinds of studies. And so I'm sure, I mean, that would be a great, I mean, AAS would be a great organization to reach out to if you have these kinds of questions. We can get you in contact with researchers who have been doing these things for years and years. And like you were saying, even just to consult.
Yeah,
and Bart, you just go ahead.
Yeah, and there's so much. So suicide, like is like you said, is something that we stumbled upon, and just this whole experience has opened us up into thinking more about doing suicide prevention work. We thought about it for a few years as we were doing cyberbullying work, and there were some personal things in my life with friends and family where I've encountered it, and so we, like on the military side, we've thought about doing communities for vets and things like that. But this has really opened it up where we want to move into this area a lot more. But suicide is just one of these areas. I mean, we have these discussions with the NIH. So we have a number of these different grants and different NIH institutes on different big data related areas, right? And I remember for one of them, through National Human Genome Research Institute, NHGRI, we had something looking at, I think it was Twitter data. It was an application looking at public Twitter data, and they were it passed peer review. They said, this is you should fund this application. It's a good application. Reviewers had no issues with human subjects. So as, I don't know how familiar all of you guys are, or your viewers are with the process for NIH grants, but there are 3 peer reviewers who typically review your applications. One of the criteria they review you on is this ethical? What are their potential human subjects issues? And they said, okay, it's public Twitter data, no issues with it. So it gets recommended to be funded. NHGRI, they say, we need to talk to your IRB because there are some potential human subjects issues here, and we need your IRB on with this. The IRB said, well, Twitter data is public information. So just as we have the view that if you are outside on the street and you overhear someone saying something on the street and that's public, Twitter data is public, so there should be no issues with public-private, and there should be no confidentiality issues with it. So that was NIHGRI, though, really wanting to take a really critical look, even after the reviewers passed it, at the ethical issues of using presumably public Twitter data. Another institute, we had something for drug-related issues and HIV, and no problems at all. They said public data, and they passed it through. So it really depends. I think there's just, it's unknown in this area, and we're learning, and it's a confusing time to be as we're learning. So we need experts with different views. And I wonder what you guys would think, how in planning something going forward. So you've got suicide researchers who could be part of a protocol, like you're saying, or part of an IRB. But what about for other areas? What about
active shooters? What about someone who's homicidal, right? So the good news is that I think that and Bart's been tweeting out some resources. The good news is that crisis response experts are really, really accustomed to doing this, where someone just sort of calls in and says surprise, and you get any of a variety of situations. And so they actually have this sort of a weird intersection of data mining, and crisis workers have some really similar sort of dilemmas, right?
Yeah, I mean, for example, Dee Hirsch covers Southern California, covers the Los Angeles area. It's an amazing. D.D. Hirsch is a crisis line that covers Southern California, and in fact, it's basically the first suicide prevention hotline that ever existed in the country. It's kind of like suicide prevention crisis hotline royalty. And so one of the things is that local universities often partner with local crisis lines. My crisis agency has partnered with Washington University on multiple Twitter-based projects, kind of like this, a little more specific to suicide. So making sure that people know about resources and what their options are, and actually knowing about your local crisis line can be really, really helpful. Because a lot of times, depending on what the load is, sometimes you need to build in some funding for them into any grants you get, if there is money. If it's really low volume stuff and it's part of their natural course, often they won't make you do that. There's times when we have not, where we've been kind of a safety valve for researchers. So it all depends on what you're needing. I think one of the things that you really had, I think why your article was so important is that this problem is, we think about, and I'm very critical of IRBs. I'll just be really honest about that. I'm sorry if this is a no reflection on Sean in any way, anybody who's watching. This is completely my opinion, only.
This is totally going to work.
And so they have not kept pace with the times.
You're just, by the way, I'm probably because of you going to have to, I'm going to have to sit on the IRB for the rest of my life.
That's great. Well, you'd be great. I think you'd be great on an IRB. You would be great because they need people who've been through these things. So IRBs are antiquated. They don't keep pace, and they haven't kept up to date. So for years, they actually prevented us from doing research and excluded participants who are identified at risk of suicide. Right, that was a really common IRB problem. They wouldn't even let us research suicide. Now, in this day and age, all IRBs should have researchers working with live subjects, be prepared for people who have an emotional crisis, because anybody can have an emotional crisis. You could be doing social psychology research that has nothing to do at all with mental health, and you could have a student who goes into a suicide crisis. What did I just read? 44% of college students are reaching out to counseling centers now for emotional support. The number of youth who are experiencing stress right now is really, really high. It doesn't make any difference whether your project is suicide related or not. You could run into a student who has an emotional crisis while you're doing research with them, and researchers need to have at least some minimal preparation for that. And the IRB and the university should have some standards. I gave some really good examples. One didn't cover unexpected. Children's Hospital of Philadelphia gave a really good bare bones example of, hey, sometimes you're going to have unexpected crises. Here's what you should be prepared for if you're doing research. So I think you've really brought to the forefront that this is something that should be standard across research institutions. It shouldn't be cumbersome, but there should be some basic guidelines that say, here, you need to at least be aware of this and account for this. And counseling centers should also be prepared for this sort of thing. I think preparation in general is just a really good thing.
Totally agree with you. And I think a concrete thing that can be done is just to add a sentence or two on a protocol that has to do with, if we're going to be monitoring people online, let the participants know your researcher may need to contact you for something, because even if it's we're constantly stepping that okay, we're monitoring you, but we don't want them to think that we're monitoring them. So if they say something, we will immediately respond to their health needs. We don't want them to think we're going to go contact your physician if you say you're taking a medication incorrectly. But I think there needs to be something in place saying, based on, I don't know what the wording would be, but something based on PI discretion, we may be in a position where we directly contact you if we feel that you or someone else in the study may be at harm from it.
Or contact help. Like that's sort of one of the other things, which is we may not contact you, we may have to contact assistance.
And another key point is you want to be really clear in the informed consent that you're not live monitoring. Right, that's something to make abundantly clear, because the resources required to provide live monitoring of social media is so cost prohibitive that it's almost impossible to do. Although you can actually, we looked at this, you can outsource this. Did you know that you can outsource social media monitoring to these farms in the Philippines? So you can do it. But even at the pennies on the dollar, it's still outrageously expensive, and there's problems with that. So when you're doing this sort of thing, and we've been involved in projects where we make it clear, if they're informed participants, we're not live monitoring this, right? And if you're in crisis, here's things that you can do.
And honestly, having used like tracking and monitoring digital tools with patients, I think you just have to sort of make patients really clear that nobody can be like right now. You just can't monitor like these kinds of digital feeds 24/7. So you must always use a crisis plan. Yeah. No one is coming in after you, guaranteed. And so you must use your crisis plan. But if I become aware of it, here's what you can depend on me to do. And it's a relatively short consent. There was a teeny little article I wrote a long time ago related to a texting app, like 8 years ago or something. But like that, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, those kinds of things, like if IRBs don't have those expertise, because I don't think that level of expertise like that Bart's explaining or that I'm explaining, I don't think that's widespread, but we should make it more easy for IRBs to be like, if you have this kind of issue, this is where you go. And I wish Chris, Chris, do you have any calm suggestions for us? Like that if you're thinking about suicide and IRB stuff, you can always check in with the American Association of Suicidology if you're not really sure about the right way to address this issue in this research, because literally the best people are there, right, Chris?
Yeah, I think that's a good place to start. And then even within providing resources, it's just a matter of what we do with all of our other messaging and saying that these resources are available: the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, Crisis Text Line, Trans Lifeline, whatever you decide to put on there, given the context of the study itself. But yeah, I really like the approach, Sean, of just keeping it kind of vague, not vague, but just enough that it can cover what you may or may not have to do with an individual participant. But it also makes it very easy to provide support if it's necessary. So not necessarily saying specifically, because we are going to be looking at your social media, we may have to reach out or provide support, but just saying that this scenario may occur. So I think that's a pretty decent approach. And then providing resources.
And Sean, I know you wanted to do some asking about data mining, but before we get to that, can you tell us a little bit about what you were recommending? Because you talked about your dilemma, but you actually had some solid recommendations in your paper, and I don't want us to get too far past that.
Yeah, so we had in place, a triage type thing of looking through. So is this a study where you're going to be monitoring people? If it's not something where you're monitoring them on social media, then this may be irrelevant. But ultimately we have, if you check out the paper, there's a checklist more or less, and it's just an introductory checklist to start a discussion. But ultimately walking you through how having someone in place, like you're saying, having someone available for ideally 24/7 surveillance, or not surveillance, but just on call, a clinician with expertise in this area, so that you can confer with him or her about what to do in a situation like this, and they can be able to, at minimum, provide some guidance. And so it talks about, depending upon what type of study you're doing, have that in place ahead of time. And I think, this discussion is making me think about, and question for you guys, just on liability and how to, I think so much of the difficulty relies on organizations not wanting liability for this and not knowing how to deal with this. Because when you're talking about social media, it's now unlimited potential. It's
for all sorts of weird edge cases, because just the N is so big, right?
Yeah, well, the N is so big, and the time is so big. So, for example, I pitched, gave a presentation to some of our residents, and was talking about something that happened a few years ago, where there was a shooter, a high school shooting, and won't name the name just for the victims of it, but the shooter killed his classmates and then killed himself. And on Twitter, you could see about a month earlier, there was evidence of this person. We've had this more recently, person was expressing things that were really disturbing, showing that there was some mental health issues the person was experiencing. A month later is when this incident happened of killing his students and then himself. And so I brought it the attention of, this is something we now have the ability to develop resources to be able to flag things like this, identify people who are in need. You guys are doing this. You're on the forefront of this. We can create these tools. Let's start implementing them in a clinic and hospital setting. And there was a lot of fear, a lot of pushback of, how do we do this? We don't, it's one thing to have patients coming to us where we can meet with them one-on-one, but we don't want to be monitoring them 24/7. We don't know how to do that. And so just thoughts from you guys on the liability issue of, you're raising your hands up. It sounds like you.
So the issue is that, number one, you can't do it. You can't do it like artisanal cheese, where you sort of manage each little case like by hand. So there are some discussions that there's probably some sort of AI human hybrid where some things get flagged, and of course Facebook is dealing with this sort of problem at large, right? Where things get flagged, and then human reviewers use sort of a set of sort of tools to sort of decide what to do, and you sort of shuttle things to the platform that is responsible for monitoring them, or to a platform that is responsible to monitoring, and using like some sort of best practice. And for there are some versions of this that are out there that aren't just Facebook, and a human can go through hundreds of flagged items in an hour or two. Based on crisis center folks I know who do some version of this, and that would be even early days. I bet it could be done faster. So there are probably plenty of systems that could be put in place and just provided to people doing the research. I would hate to make researchers responsible for reinventing the wheel for what are, like, we can predict in these really large data sets, you're going to have a certain amount of suicidality, homicide, murder, suicide, homicide. There will just be a certain number of edge cases, and it's not unknowable. Bart, Tony, Chris?
And I'm talking about at the health system level now, where health systems are very risk averse. And so first of all, they're not going to incorporate something that Facebook's built or that some other, it's got to be.
So I work in Veterans Affairs, and we have the Veterans Crisis Line. And if somebody pops something open on Facebook, we have several ways we deal with it. And we manage liability all the time, that someone can post something on Facebook, the crisis line can get wind of it. It's also our patient. And we work it out. Like, literally, I just did a case like a week ago. That just sort of gets worked out all the time. Like, that's a normal part of caring for patients. And you just sort of make a policy. That's how you do all liability. You just make a policy and you follow it. And if it's a lot of patients, there are probably various ways that you can be aware of that, either for research purposes or for health system purposes. And it's like, I have a social media policy. So when my patients try to Facebook me that they're suicidal, I have a policy that I follow with that. And it goes, I don't want to say smoothly, because I don't want to minimize that people are suffering, and we've had follow-up, but it's been a relatively straightforward situation. Bart, Chris, Tony?
So I think that, go ahead, Tony.
Low base rate events, Bart. I think it's a valid point. I think it's an important point to set, that even though the media response, I think that clinicians and healthcare administrators are just as susceptible to believing that these events are going to happen to them at any given time, and that there's danger around every corner, even though the real stats on this stuff, thank goodness, are incredibly low. It's a very rare event.
Suicidality is not.
No, suicidal behavior is not, but death from suicide is. So, thank goodness. We want to keep it that way. I wouldn't want to change that. but the fact is that there's 1.2 million plus attempts in the United States every year, and the numbers that everybody trumpets are the people who die, and that's 45,000. Well, we want less people to die, period. But when you're trying to make policy to try to help people, is it the most? Should you have a protocol and a policy that's reasonable and safe and effective? Sure, you should. Should you debug that? Should you track the outcomes of it? Sure, yeah. But is it going to be, are you at much more danger of slip and fall from your employees? Oh, yes.
Sorry.
By far.
It's true.
So go ahead, Bart.
Well, I think there's a couple of different things. I think that, yes, you're more likely to be at risk from a slip and fall from an employee, but the general level of damages and moral damage and emotional damage of being involved in someone's suicide death is exponentially larger. So I think that when we talk about liability, there's a couple of things I always like to break out. And Skip Simpson, who's the most amazing attorney who talks about this, is that it's not just about your legal liability around suicide. People have a moral and emotional liability. They don't want to be or feel responsible or feel like they could have done more, right? That weight is often even bigger in driving some of the weird things we see people do around suicide than the actual legal liability. So I think April's points are really good points. And I think if I had to distill this, I would say that the courts and the case law is really clear. Nobody's expected to be able to predict suicide. The courts recognize that.
Although Sean's going to do it with his fancy institute.
Yes, that could happen. That it certainly could happen. The other piece of this is that we can't let fear of these low base rate events stop us from doing really important work. But we should be prepared and have a policy and procedure in place that shows that we were thoughtful about this and ethical. So people think, a lot of people think that ethics is this code that's written in stone. You do this, you don't do that. And ethics is really more a way of approaching problems. That ethical reasoning makes it very clear that you can't always know the right answer, that often there is no right answer. You've got to use the evidence base and your own thoughtfulness and develop a procedure that shows we considered this, we accounted for this, and we were true. We followed our planned implementation. That's what ethical.
A little useful airtime. He's done some amazing work in the standards for inpatient care.
Who are we talking about?
Skip Simpson. So when Skip's primary point is that if you have a patient that is ill and you are in charge of caring for that patient, you should care for their health. That's basically Skip's underlying premise. Even if that person is suicidal, you should care about whether they're going to die or not. He's not really talking about random cases you might detect in using algorithms with your entire population. That's not really what that's not Skip's area of practice. But go ahead.
But I think Skip's approach translates into how you think about these things and how you implement your procedures. Skip would also tell you that the less control you have over the situation, the less liable you are. So the liability is much higher if you're an inpatient facility. It drops to, if you're an intensive outpatient, it drops to even more if you're an outpatient. And if you're a researcher who's monitoring people in a social media study, your risk exposure drops tremendously because your ability to control and your responsibility is quite minimal. So these are all things that we should consider as we're proceeding.
And I cannot say enough. You can have a social media policy that includes this stuff in your research, and it's probably not an infinite number of things. It's probably relatively short, and you can have a standard, write it down, and follow it, and that manages liability actually quite a lot, especially if you're trying to act in the best interest and you're consulting with others. So try to act in their best interest, consult with others, have a policy, and follow it, like all liability management. But that's liability versus doing the right thing. We're getting close on time. I want to do just a little shout out to Twirl and Swirl, Amelia, happy birthday. I believe it's Bacon, right? Whose birthday it is. Elise just joined us. And Travis, oh my God. So we're saying hi to all our friends, Sean, like they just keep popping up. What do you think about this spiel of liability that we've sent at you, like the speed of hyperspace? I know, directed that at you, Sean. Oh, you're on mute. Go ahead.
That was directed at me. So the background on this was we had done some work looking at patients in hospital settings, had been tweeting about sexual abuse they'd experienced. They'd been tweeting about just uncomfortable situations they've had with providers. And we've also done, so we haven't talked about this at all here, but what got me into all the monitoring work was behavior change work that we've done. We've done a bunch of online communities. Right? Wrote a book called Stick With It last year. Came out last year on.
You can buy it on Amazon. We tweeted out the link. Anyway, keep going.
Thank you. Thank you. And so that book describes this behavior change work. And then through these online communities that we do, where we found through using technologies, through using online communities, we've done VR studies, AR, different types of technologies, which we've been able to really successfully get people to change their behavior, get tested for diseases, change drug use. But in running these online communities, we found people would talk about all kinds of really personal things. And that's what got us into this area to begin with, because we realized through, for example, our earlier studies were HIV studies, we'd have a 12-week online community designed to get people to increase HIV testing, which was successful. And you see what they talk about, and they talk about who they'll have sex with, they talk about the drugs they'll use, they'll talk about all kinds of personal things. And so we started developing these models, realizing we could actually predict who's going to request an HIV test based on what they're talking about on these communities. So let's start doing this in a bunch of different areas. So we started doing it for working with California Highway Patrol to predict car crashes, doing this study with freshman students to predict stress. We were looking at sexual misconduct and things like that that happen in a hospital setting. And in talking to the health system and the hospitals, we are trying to find support for, hey, look, this is a thing. We can be able to look at what people are talking about and learn a lot from it. And we're creating these maps and visualization tools. We're working with public health officials around the country right now to develop maps and tools to tell them what people are talking about and help them with their work. Why don't we do this at a health system level and start following our patients on social media so that we can be able to, we know that we can improve patient outcomes. We can probably get people feeling more comfortable with their providers and happier about the health system if we do these remote behavior change interventions. And then we can monitor patients and figure out more what their needs are. And that's where a lot of this discomfort and pushback came back from. Well, when they come into a clinical setting, we see them and we know what to expect. But if you're talking about 24/7 ability to have access to everything they're talking about, we're not ready for that.
No, and you can just say, we don't, like, there is no good system for that, and we aren't going to do it, which is, by the way, what I do recommend and have recommended for years, and I agree with that. It is that time of the night. The hour has flown by. We're already at final thoughts. Tony Wood, final thoughts.
It's the future of population-based medicine. This is what's going to happen. So it's work like the work they're doing in UCLA, and MIT and Harvard and Stanford and
Fitbit
that will transform. That will transform what we used to think of, what we currently think of as behavioral health, but I believe is really just a part of the spectrum of overall medical care.
Chris Maxwell.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I learned tonight was that, as we start to create these initiatives and these efforts using the big data approach and new technology, it will behoove us all to try to stay educated on the technology that people are using and how that data is being used by any number of different groups, and being prepared for whatever the context is, making sure that we have social media policies in place, making sure that we have suicide prevention and crisis intervention policies in place in what we're doing, because behavioral health, depression, suicide, it affects pretty much everything we do, and no one is immune. So make sure you've got it in place, and we can use all of that to educate others in the meantime.
Bart Andrews.
I, for one, applaud Sean. I thought his paper was so incredibly powerful because it exemplifies what we mean by contributing to the literature base. Here's this thing that is going to happen to other people. Sean and his team, they ran into this, they solved the problem, and then they wrote a paper and said, this is what happened, this is what we learned from it, and you all need to be aware of it. And this is exactly what good researchers do. And so that's why I was so excited about having you on the show, and I appreciate you being in here and tolerating our what at times may seem zany, but is really not. It's a sober conversation about things that really matter. I think that's how people define SPSM around the world.
Or the Muppet Show of Suicide Prevention. We know.
I've heard that too.
Both of those. Sean, final thoughts.
Yeah, for me, it's always keep learning. I'm always learning. This whole situation came from not being aware of something, and we've learned so much through the process. You know, I was on a panel last week. We threw an event with the UCLA Alumni Association for the intersection of health and tech, and they wanted me to give an opening talking about my background. And I studied ethnomusicology in undergrad. I was in punk bands and kind of, you know, somehow made my way over. And they said, "Oh, this is great. You'll make our students feel better who have no idea what they're going to be doing in the future." And to me, I just continue learning so much more. And so that's, I think, still the take home for me, just having conversations with you guys. I'm really glad that we wrote this article. It led to meeting you guys. And there's just a lot more that I have to learn about, which is exciting for me as a researcher and person in general, human being in the world. So I think that's the take home for me. Just, you know, keep on putting myself out there, and hopefully others, so we talk to each other and learn from each other.
So just my final thought really quickly, you know, it used to be when you were looking at IRBs and you were thinking about research and ethics, there was going to be a live person in front of you, and you were going to like in a very constrained, predictable situation, and it was only going to be like 200 people, and like what could go wrong kind of a deal, right? But this kind of research, this big data research, means that these low base rate items, and suicidality isn't that low base rate of an item, but like these sorts of things are going to bubble up that people wouldn't have thought of before, because it just wouldn't have come across. They just wouldn't have come across the situation. And so I'm going to steal Rin Linthicum's final thought. Really intriguing conversation tonight. Super interested to see where research and treatment goes from here, and the ethical debates that accompany it. That's good to know. Everybody, this has been another hour. It happened. It's been happening for 5 years. Hashtag SPSM.
Wow.
We're going to be wrapping up the season next week, next week. Season 5 wraps up next week. We're going to be discussing, you know, goal and content setting, and really changing what we're doing, like for the next couple of years. The facts were that when we started this 5 years ago, we had a really specific agenda and content area, and it wasn't well known at all, and we really wanted to influence
And that
everyone.
was to retail flat pack furniture.
Retail flat. And then in fact we did it. So now it's time to figure out what
We pivoted away from flat pack furniture.
What we should do next. So come on next week to help inform our planning and goal setting for the next
Not failure, it's a pivot.
Everybody take care. Bye.
Bye.
Good night.